The question of what would have happened if Walter White hadn't died sounds simple. He would have run away, gone into hiding, lived under a new identity. But in the world of Breaking Bad, running away was never a real solution, only a way to buy time. It wasn't the police who ultimately exposed Walter. It was always Walter himself, his need for control, his obsession with writing his own story, and his constant insistence on the lie that I did it because I had to. Now, let's return to the finale night. Walter enters Jack's compound, activates the automatic machine gun setup. Most of the people inside die. Jesse breaks free from the chains. Walter gets shot and falls to the ground. This is where the series ends. So what if Walter hadn't died? The logical way to approach this question is not to ask where would Walter have run to, but what problems would have grown if Walter had survived? Because death silences the biggest witness, but survival makes the witness talk, and this witness is Heisenberg himself. In the scenario where Walter doesn't die, the first scene is usually not Walter crawls away into the darkness, as people imagine. The most realistic beginning is the sirens, because this is not an ordinary crime scene, but a mass casualty event, an automatic weapon setup, dozens of bullet marks, a burned chemical area, corpses, blood, gunpowder, vehicle tracks, a fire alarm, gunshots heard by people in the vicinity. In other words, this is no longer a place where someone could disappear. It becomes an event that triggers all the reflexes of the state. The ambulance taking Walter to the hospital doesn't end the story. On the contrary, it formalizes Walter's own disaster, because this time, Walter is not facing a single stubborn detective, but a case that all institutions say we have to explain. When Walter opens his eyes, he faces this reality for the first time. Heisenberg's shadow no longer empowers him, but weighs him down, because legendary criminal figures become legends not because they escape, but because they leave behind a huge wreckage even when caught, and Walter's wreckage is now in plain sight. Here's the critical thing. Even if Hank is dead, the case doesn't close. On the contrary, Hank's absence transforms the investigation from a personal vendetta into a matter of institutional honor. When the DEA loses an agent, it doesn't say, let it go. It says, this case cannot be closed. We didn't see this directly in the series, but that's how the world works. Reports grow, budgets open, teams change, but the case doesn't close. As long as Walter isn't dead, it's not a getaway story, it's a capture process. If you've watched this video this far, know that every piece of content is prepared with serious effort. There are hours of research, writing, and editing behind it. If you want these kinds of videos to continue, subscribing to the channel really makes a difference. It won't bother you, but it will be a great motivation for me. Thank you in advance for your support. So, will Walter be caught? Most likely yes, because Walter's greatest weakness is leaving a trail. Even surviving that night's compound doesn't give him an advantage because there's no environment left to hide in. Jack's men are dead, Lydia's connections are already shaky, Saul is long gone, Mike is gone, Gus is gone. The network that made Walter invisible has been torn apart. Let's say Walter miraculously avoids capture on the first day and manages to escape from the hospital. Even that won't save him. It will only create a new problem. Walter is no longer a man in hiding, he becomes a fugitive legend, and this draws everyone's attention to him. But the real turning point comes here. When Walter survives, the nightmare for the family continues. In the series finale, death was closure. Painful, but closure. Walter's survival doesn't end the pressure Skylar has carried for years. It prolongs it, because Walter breathing means the newspapers printing the same name every day, the police knocking on the same door every day, the children hearing the same whispers at school every day. Remember Skylar's character. She is not someone who makes emotional decisions, but someone who turns fear into calculations. Where is the money? How to hide the trail? Which words carry which risks? If Walter lives, Skylar's options become more difficult. Either she will remain silent and live in fear for the rest of her life, or she will speak up and try to protect her children. And if Skylar approaches speaking up, Walter's greatest illusion, built over years, collapses. I'm in control. Because the moment Skylar speaks, control completely shifts to the state. Walt Jr.'s attitude toward Walter in this scenario becomes even more painful, because death gives the child a sense of it's over, but prison and court proceedings mean living it all over again every day. Walter's survival doesn't mean Walt Jr. loses his father again. It means he has to see his father on TV every day. Therefore, it's more likely that Walt Jr. will openly reject Walter. And this is what hurts Walter's ego the most. Walter's whole For My Family story is thrown away live on air by his own family. So how does Walter play at this point? Interestingly, Walter's strongest side comes into play again: storytelling. Walter is as much a manipulator as he is a chemist. In a crisis, he writes himself a role. The role he would play in the scenario he finds himself in is probably not that of the monster, but rather that of the man who does the right thing at the last minute. I went to save Jesse. I went to finish them off. I tried to protect my family. This suits his soul. Walter wants to appear justified rather than evil. If he goes to trial, he will try to present himself as a kind of tragic anti-hero. Cancer, the system, money, helplessness. But the cruel side of Breaking Bad is this: Walter is confronted not with an emotional jury, but with technical evidence: money flow, phone records, chemical supply chain, old lab connections, witness statements. Walter's "I had to" statement clashes with the reality of "you chose for years." And this is where the Jesse factor becomes decisive. In the series finale, Jesse's escape was a kind of void. When Walter dies, Jesse's target disappears, making it easier for him to breathe and move on. If Walter lives, a single knot grows in Jesse's mind: this man is still alive. What makes Jesse is not just revenge, but conscience. But Walter is a constant source of poison for Jesse's conscience. Jesse can take two paths. Either he stays silent and goes far away, but rots from the inside out, or he speaks up, and this speech becomes a blow to Walter heavier than death, because there was a flaw in all the systems Walter built: Jesse's emotional fragility. Walter exploited this for years. If Jesse now turns it around and says, "I won't lie anymore," Walter's courtroom strategy collapses. Jesse's testimony does more than technically finish Walter off. It shatters Walter's "I did it for the family" narrative, because Jesse has seen not only Walter's crimes, but also his intentions: power, respect, the desire to win. In Walter's universe, what will truly finish him off is not a bullet, but Jesse's decision to tell everything. Let's say Jesse never spoke, disappeared. Even that wouldn't save Walter, because the world around Walter no longer tolerates emptiness. Even someone like Lydia surviving is no guarantee for Walter, because we know what Lydia will do in a moment of panic. Those types of people aren't loyal. They're loyal to survival. If Walter lives, Lydia collapses even sooner, talks more, leaves more traces. Saul's absence also isolates Walter. Walter has intelligence, but he can't play the law game as well as Saul. Let's say Walter manages to survive without getting caught. That's when Walter's real curse comes into play. Hiding isn't enough for him. We're talking about a man who returned even though he could have lived in New Hampshire. That means breathing isn't the same as living for Walter. If Walter survives and escapes, he will make another mistake at some point, because he wants to prove himself. He wants to say, "I'm still here," perhaps through an old connection, perhaps a secret phone call, perhaps a foolish move to see his son from afar. In this universe, Walter's capture ceases to be a mere possibility and becomes almost inevitable. When he is caught, something interesting happens. It's not the straightforward Walter rots in prison that the viewer expects, but Walter's search for control, even inside. Walter cannot be an ordinary prisoner. He is a man trying to figure out the chemistry of his environment. Prison means a loss of power for him, and that loss of power always triggers the same reflex in him: to establish a new order, to carve out a place for himself, to produce some kind of value. Maybe he becomes a source of information. Maybe he provides the brains for a chemical job for those inside. Maybe he thinks he can protect himself by instilling fear with the name Heisenberg. But it is precisely here that the price of Walter's survival becomes heavy. The name Heisenberg brings both respect and a target inside. Legendary people don't have it easy inside, because everyone wants to test the legend. What death closed for Walter reopens here every day. Every day someone looks at him and asks, "Are you the one?" Every day someone wants something from him. Every day someone is his enemy. Outside, Walter had money, a plan, an escape route. Inside, Walter has only his name, and a name sometimes keeps a person alive, sometimes devours them alive. Meanwhile, the family situation doesn't improve. For Skylar, Walter's survival means the past isn't over. Skylar may make a deal, may confess some things, may take a harder line to protect the children, but whichever path she chooses, if Walter is alive, his shadow constantly lingers in the house. For Walter Jr., this is not mourning his father's death and departure, but rather the shame of, "My father is a monster and he's still breathing." A person's relationship with shame is also different from mourning, because mourning softens over time, but shame is triggered every day. For Marie, the Hank issue becomes even more acute. When Walter dies, Hank's revenge is in a sense left to fate, but if Walter lives, Marie's whole life becomes fixated on one thing: we lost Hank because of this man, and this man is still alive. In other words, Walter's survival prolongs not only his own trauma, but also that of everyone around him. And the most ironic part, in the scenario where Walter doesn't die, Walter doesn't get what he wanted. Walter always wanted to leave a legacy for his son to get the money, for his name to be remembered as having succeeded in some way, at least to be vindicated in his own eyes. Yet, by staying alive, the legacy he spoke of is reduced to a single word: Heisenberg. Walter White's name, the name of Walter the teacher, the name of Walter the father, those little stories of pride, all are erased, leaving only the criminal figure behind. Death packaged Walter's story like a dramatic finale. Living, however, trivializes it, squeezing it into court proceedings, news bulletins, reports, procedures. And this is what truly punishes Walter. Walter wants to play big, wants to be epic, wants to believe he bargained with fate. But when he survives, fate tells him, no, you are not an epic finale. You are a long reckoning. Ultimately, if Walter White hadn't died, he would probably have bought himself a little more time with a few short-term moves. He would have tried to turn his story into that of the man who did the right thing at the last minute, hoped Jesse would keep quiet, tried to keep Skylar under control. But in the medium term, evidence, witnesses, and human nature would catch up with him, because there was always one weak point in the systems Walter built: Walter's pride. If Walter had lived, it wouldn't be the bullet that killed him, but the reality he would have to face every day, that what he said he did for my family was actually for himself, and everyone would see it. And perhaps the harshest answer is this: if Walter had died, it would have been an end. If Walter had lived, it would have been punishment, because Walter White's greatest fear was not death. It was becoming insignificant, losing control, accepting that he was not the author of the story. The true punishment Walter would receive in the world he inhabited is precisely this: to breathe, but no longer be able to control anything, to speak, but have no one believe him, to boast about being Heisenberg, but have the name Heisenberg devour him rather than protect him. Today, we looked at an alternative and rarely discussed side of Breaking Bad by imagining the possibility that Walter White didn't die. Behind the events we saw in the series, there was actually another story that could have unfolded in very different ways. I hope this theory made you think, I never looked at it that way. So what do you think would have happened if Walter White had actually survived? Would Jesse's fate have changed, or would everything still lead to the same ending? Be sure to write your own theories in the comments. I really enjoy reading them. Also, don't forget to mention which movies or series you'd like to see similar theory videos about in the future. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video for more.